Okay, good morning, or sorry, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 3 of Modern Slavery Skills Training Workshops. Today's webinar, Keep Your Business Wheels Spinning with the Right Modern Slavery Framework with Stephen Morse. Today you are listening in using your computer speaker system by default. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to Stephen by typing them into the questions pane on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end. A little bit about Dr. Stephen Morse. Dr. Stephen Morse is the CEO of Unchained Solutions. Based in Sydney, Stephen leads a team of modern slavery consultants who provide a turnkey solution to help Australian organisations to comply with the Modern Slavery Act 2018. Through his extensive research and lived experience abroad, Stephen demonstrates empathy for those who need to address modern slavery and shines a light on how leaders can innovate, engage, and embrace the opportunities to develop responsible business practices and resilient supply chains. I'll now hand this over to Stephen. Thanks, Stephen. I think you've got yourself on mute still.
Well, it's great to be here as part of Unchained's partnership with APPA. We're running a series of workshops this side of the year. This is our third workshop for APPA and their members, and we do trust that it's inspiring for you. Do welcome your feedback and your comments, and for you to put questions in the chat. I will make sure I have time for people to ask those questions. This topic can leave people a little bit stunned, and they're sort of like, "Oh, I don't know how to ask a question about any of this." But please feel free to do that. And if you can't think of the question today, then please, by all means, send me an email or get in touch with me afterwards. You see I've got a QR code there that you should all be well versed in seeing these kind of things. That goes to my link tree, which gives you all my comms, all my socials and everything. So that won't necessarily end up meaning that you're on my email list. That's not the intention. It's more of a way of different ways in which you can get in contact with me, and we can talk further about your specific issues. All right, so I'm just going to begin with a acknowledgement of country. Recognizing that people are joining us from many parts. Today, I'm speaking from Gadigal country, upon which parts of the northern beaches of the Sydney area are based. And so in the spirit of reconciliation, Unchained acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and we extend that respect to all Indigenous Australians, those who identify as Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Okay, well, let's begin with a bit of a screen share. Most of it's going to be actually on the screen for you. And as I said before, if you've got any questions along the way, I just invite you to put them in the chat. All right. Very good. Sorry. Let me bring that up. Okay, so just a little bit about Unchained. Thanks, Tony, for the introduction. So Unchained inspires Australian organisations to be leaders in making an impact on modern slavery. And so we're really here to work with a range of companies, and we do work with a range of companies. We see there's so much scope for inspiration in this space because it is such a dark issue, but also more importantly for leadership. And there's lots of leadership that can be demonstrated, particularly through peer-to-peer and peer and sort of entity to supplier collaboration, making sure that there's a full range of stakeholders engaged, and that does require some courage and some leadership. And we really are about making an impact on modern slavery. We're not here to necessarily just make that impact on companies, but to actually make that impact on the survivors of modern slavery. We do see the Modern Slavery Act, and we look forward to this act in its revised format, which should happen this year. We really do see this as a really good vehicle for businesses to make the impact. It's not perfect. There are lots of gaps and holes in it, which have recently been addressed through a consultation process. And we're looking forward to the way in which Parliament engages with that and implements many of those recommendations once those recommendations have been revealed. And we can talk a little bit about that later if you like, what the kind of things we need to happen to strengthen this law. But it's a really good vehicle that can be used for other social impact areas to make a really good impact. Unchained pitches itself as a social enterprise in the sense that we give a portion of our profits to go to ending modern slavery through funding freedom sort of social enterprises that are part of the Freedom Business Alliance, mainly through my own engagement with different peak body groups, both in Australia and overseas. We do a lot of pro bono volunteer work as well in order to advance the conversation and make sure that people understand what it is that they're looking at when it comes to modern slavery. In terms of our value as a company, the Unchained team has a unique lived experience component as well as technical skills and expertise. So many on our team have come from a background where they've had touch points with those who are affected by modern slavery. That includes myself and my wife, who spent 5 years working in Madrid, Spain, with survivors of sex trafficking. And we've really combined that with people who've got skills and expertise in different ways in terms of supply chain analysis, strategy, policy development, training, and engagement. And we're really here to help organizations excel and accelerate the UN Sustainable Development Goals, of which I've mentioned 4 that we in particular target and help companies with especially. We have a turnkey solution comprising strategy, analysis, training, documents, and research. It's very comprehensive. Basically means you can come to Unchained and we can service you, whether you are advanced with the Modern Slavery Act, just starting out, have no idea what you're doing, don't need to report. We work with a range of entities, both SMEs, not-for-profits, ASX listed, through a wide spectrum of industries. And all our solution areas have a number of services that we can, in a bespoke way, wrap around whatever size, need, maturity for an organization to help them to advance in the work that they're doing. As I mentioned, we've worked with a number of sectors, including mining, education, agriculture, finance, not-for-profits, retail, logistics, health, and construction. So it's quite bespoke in that sense, or industry agnostic. When everyone asks me what's your target market, it's like I will work with everybody because we're we're not an industry focused, we are an issues focused organization, and we enjoy and really get a lot of pleasure out of working with a range of sectors and their particularities, because there's the common theme and the thread, if you like, of everyone is addressing this issue, and that has to do with their frameworks, their strategies, their policies, their risk assessment, their statements, and that sort of covers a range of industries. So we're not put off by any particular industry. We actually enjoy the interaction, and that strengthens our own offering to organizations as we learn from different sectors. So today I just want to cover off the risk of modern slavery and what that is. You may have some level of awareness of that, but I just want to cover that off this afternoon in terms of some of the recent developments. The impact of the legislation, particularly the Commonwealth Act and the New South Wales Act on corporate Australia, and then look at specifically what are the issues for small business, recognizing that many of the members of APPA are small businesses. And what does this actually mean for me? Because, I could be a one-man band and I don't really know what I can do, what leverage I have, how I can actually make an impact, or even do any form of due diligence work at all. So what is it that my clients are asking of me, and what can I actually seriously do? So let's just cover some things off. This year, actually back in April, marked the 10th year and 10th anniversary of the collapse of the Rana Plaza in Dhaka, Bangladesh. This was a huge travesty that occurred and really put a spotlight internationally on the whole entire apparel industry, which I know has lots of touch points with promotional products and merchandising. This incident occurred because a factory was poorly constructed, and there were cracks in the walls that were being noticed by the female staff at this place. And these cracks were getting bigger and bigger over subsequent weeks. But management failed to address these issues and ignored the complaints of the women. It was on the morning of this accident that the women went into work and then realized that they were the building was unstable. And so actually attempted to leave the building, but they were actually shoved back into the building by management and security, upon which then the whole entire building collapsed. and some 1,100 women, female workers, died during that incident, and had a huge impact on that whole area, as you can see from this image, the devastation, the destruction, and really put a spotlight on big brands, many of whom were actually buying garments from this factory and the surrounding factories in order to sell to big markets elsewhere. And so this whole incident, it's 10 years now, and the question has obviously been raised, particularly by human rights lawyers, is what has actually happened, what's actually changed in the landscape since 2013. Well, we know that the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, which came in 2015, that was really a direct result, I think, of this actual incident. And later in 2018, we had the Australian Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act and New South Wales Acts as well. And since then, there's been lots of other initiatives by, particularly at state level, around ethical sourcing policies, human rights policies, governments committing themselves to only buying from suppliers that actually have adherence to environmental and social and good governance structures. There has been a lot of activity, but unfortunately, given some of the occurrences and situations that have occurred in our world of recent years, notably COVID, the situation has not necessarily improved across the board. We know, for example, that when the first lockdowns occurred back in March 2020, there was $3 billion worth of goods were either cancelled or suspended, particularly in the garment industry. And this put a lot of people's jobs at risks. And unlike in a situation like in Australia, where we had JobKeeper benefits, of which I actually benefit from at that time, many of these countries, Bangladesh and Southeast Asia, don't have such protections and sort of a safety net for their workers. And so once a person loses their job, it's often the children that are sent out to find work because they can be hired at lower rates. And this then immediately increases the risk of slavery and exploitation for these people. So things have in some sense improved in terms of governance and policy, but actually, given the nature of the world, natural disasters, as well as health crisis, the situation is not necessarily decreased. And we know, for example, from recent reports, both from the International Labour Organization in 2021, that the number of people in a situation of slavery was increased from 40 million to 50 million. And just this week, the Global Slavery Index came out, put out by Walk Free Foundation. And in terms of the numbers for Australia, the numbers have gone from 15,000 cases in Australia to 41,000, which is kind of to be expected because we had assessed already that those numbers were quite low and quite conservative from the previous report. So what is modern slavery? Well, according to Unseen UK, modern slavery is the commodification of people for the purpose of exploitation and financial gain. So really what we're talking about here when it comes to slavery is something very much in the area of business and commerce, where people are taking advantage from in order to gain a profit. And the situation that we have today in regards to modern slavery risk is really very much part of the global economic framework in which we operate in, where those at the top, benefit from those at the bottom, and quite a large bottom of people who don't actually benefit much from their labors, and all the profits go elsewhere. At an acute level, modern slavery, from a human rights approach, is really the absence, the lack of, or the removal or restriction of a person's choice, movement, and voice. People in situations of slavery or slave or on that spectrum really lack choices in terms of what they can actually do. And whilst there could be a lot of opportunism in modern slavery risk, that opportunism arises out of a lack of issues of poverty and a lack of choice in terms of how people work and where they choose to work. Could be a lack of movement, just in terms of people being monitored for their movements and not being able to go in certain places, so that, for example, their movements can be controlled. And there could be a lack of voice or a lack of agency, where someone is not able to actually speak out about their situation. They can't unionize, they can't actually make any changes through their own level of agency. Modern slavery is also being used as a legislative term. It's not used by all governments, but it's used by the Australian government and the UK government to describe a number of human rights violations, including forced labour, forced servitude, debt bondage, child labour or extreme forms of child labour, forced marriage, and human trafficking. And so really what we can see here, that whilst there are certain categories under this umbrella of modern slavery, it's really that these types of violations all work in with each other. A person who is trafficked may be trafficked because they're fallen into debt bondage, and therefore they're made vulnerable and therefore moved from one place or one town or jurisdiction to another. And then they could be forced into some level of forced work, either in a domestic context in terms of servitude, or labor in terms of a factory, farm, or fisheries. Children can be involved in that process, and there could be something contractual in the nature of a forced marriage scenario as well. It's very difficult for us to identify a case of modern slavery. It is very much on the extreme end of exploitation. Modern slavery sits on a continuum, and so at the lighter end, there might be issues around wage theft, or someone's passport is taken for safekeeping purposes, for example. There may be subsistence or some sort of accommodation that's not appropriate. There could be sort of forms of physical or sexual abuse, for example. There's sort of a spectrum of different experiences of people. I think what's probably safe to say is that the greater the cluster of indicators that I have here on the screen really is sort of indicative. Really, they indicate that the case is the seriousness of the case. So the more indicators we have, I think the more we can say that this is a case of modern slavery. It may not necessarily always change our response in terms of due diligence or remediation. We should always be addressing issues of workplace exploitation, whatever they fall in the spectrum. Issues of wage theft, for example, which may be more at the top, that should be very much addressed, because we're looking at sometimes these issues can be a slide into degrees of seriousness. Not to minimize the seriousness of wage theft, but in relation to more of the extreme forms and extreme types. In terms of the scope, this slide has just been updated this week. We have 50 million, as I mentioned. 1 in 4 victims or survivors, if you like, are children, and at least 73%. So we have a very much a gender inequality represented here, in the sense that those who are most vulnerable in our communities are those who are at the greatest risk. We're looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry. Most of the risk is contained within situations of forced labor, so where most of our goods are made or harvested or fished. And then in terms of the cases in Australia, this latest report, which you can look at, 41,000 now cases in Australia. But this ratio of 1 to 5 is really about only 1 in 5 cases are reported in Australia, which is quite surprising, but really points to the hiddenness of this issue and the unwillingness of people to actually speak out. Apologies, should actually change that graphic, because I did in another slide and we've missed out Tasmania, so no offense to those in Tasmania. Some examples of exploitation that you may be mindful of and have touch points with the industry that you're in have to do with, for example, the production of cocoa and coffee beans through in parts of the world, particularly West Africa and parts of South America. The garment industry, as I mentioned earlier, has a very long supply chain and complex supply chain, and the risks have been well noted. The spotlight there in terms of the various touch points of when modern slavery risk occurs. And more recently, in the last 10 years, a spotlight has been put on fisheries, particularly off the coast of Thailand, to actually look at the situation of young men spending months at a time at sea without breaks, going from boat to boat, and then through their own sickness and weakness, then simply discarded overboard when they are unfit to work. And this issue also has a spotlight on it, and some work has been done. A lot of work's been done by Thai Union, which is the largest producer of seafood in Thailand, to address this human rights violation. Apart from these high consumables and those that are very much part of the sort of consumer market, modern slavery risks occur in most industries. It'd be very hard to find an industry that doesn't have some touch point with modern slavery risk, whether that's in the harvesting of raw materials, for example, in ICT, with risks to people in DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where a lot of our minerals are mined. And these risks really then have a touch point with all our efforts around environmentalism and sort of ethical sourcing of energy. Green energy may actually have a touch point with modern slavery risk. And so this is where the complexities are enhanced. Other industries that you may be part of as well, the risks may be at the harvesting, at the farm level, or the mining level, but a lot of them could be at the assemblage factory level as well. And so it's important for us to consider risks both in terms of where the goods and services that we buy, risks in terms of our operations, where we could be having cleaning firms or security or hospitality industry, for example. The risks are not just in the supply chain, that they're servicing our facilities, servicing our operations in Australia, and as well as happening in factories, on farms, and in fisheries. So it's a very complex space. You may have been aware of this, but most recently, particularly in light of COVID-19, a big spotlight has been put on the production of PPE. This article here highlights a situation that occurred in terms of Top Glove, which is a manufacturer of PPE supplying rubber gloves and other protective products to the NHS in the UK. And there was a ban put on this company because of some of the violations that occurred. Let me just note from the article some of the features of this article. It says that Top Glove, the world's largest manufacturer of rubber gloves, has been banned from exporting its products from Malaysia to the United States after the US Customs and Border Protection made a finding that its products are made using forced and indentured labor. Rubber medical gloves from a Malaysian manufacturer will be seized if they enter the US due to a conclusive evidence that they're being made by workers on conditions of modern slavery. Last year, The Guardian found that gloves from Top Glove have been supplied to the NHS, although it's the NHS supply chain, the delivery of supply of healthcare products for the NHS, stated that it no longer needed to have a contract with that company. The majority of workers at Top Glove are migrants from Nepal and Bangladesh. Many were forced to pay high fees to recruitment agents to get their jobs, leaving them vulnerable to debt bondage. Workers have alleged that they are put to work for 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with some earning as little as £7 a day, to live in squalid dormitories shared by more than 20 workers. Top Glove has denied all these allegations. In the last financial year, this is 2021, Top Glove's profits rose by 417% over the previous year as demand soared for rubber gloves to combat the coronavirus pandemic. And so basically in summary, what we can say is that the demand for PPE through the pandemic actually put at risk, increased the risk. Our demand for things actually in some areas of the world lowered restrictions, lowered regulations in order to stimulate demand, stimulate the supply, and get those supplies, so that on the one hand, whilst we were trying to protect ourselves, in some parts of the world, other people were being affected by the risk of forced labor issues. So it's something to consider as we do business in our world and the complexities of that. So let's just move then to what's actually going on in terms of the Australian landscape. You may be mindful of the Modern Slavery Act, both at the Commonwealth level and the state level for New South Wales. Both these legislations have been around since 2018, although the state one for New South Wales went into a harmonisation process for about 2 years, whilst they worked out how it could actually work in tandem with the Commonwealth Act, which took precedence, even though it was enacted afterwards. And really, when it comes to the Modern Slavery Act and its impact, there are really 3 words for us to consider: transparency, responsibility, and effectiveness. So when we're thinking about what's being asked of companies, particularly those who have to report, is that they are transparent in terms of actually making an investment to identify the risks and being transparent to themselves, but also through the reporting mechanism of the Modern Slavery Act, being transparent to the government and the Australian public in terms of actually what they're doing to address these issues. Once transparency leads to responsibility, it's not enough for companies to identify risk. They also have to both assess it and then address it. And so there are lots of steps that companies can take to take responsibility for this risk, to make sure that they go further than just the identification, and work out and develop strategies around remediation and grievance, and actually work to resolve this issue, to improve supply chains, develop supplier relationships, and really, in a sense, improve quality through an environmental and social lens. And then finally, one of the key aspects and a weak area in terms of reporting is around impact measurement and around the word effectiveness. So all the activities that companies have to do, it has to be effective, and they need to demonstrate what they're doing to measure the impact that they're making. It's not just enough to be busy looking like you're doing something. You actually have to demonstrate and have a framework for measuring impact and what that impact looks like. And that can be very difficult for organizations to do. Many organizations might wish to simply mitigate or minimize modern slavery risk, but they're not necessarily in the position to do so because they're so far removed from where the risk actually occurs. And so it's very important in terms of the reporting mechanism that companies have good goals, have good KPIs, have very clear understanding of their business ecosystem, where they can leverage influence, where they can actually affect change, and what they can actually measure. Because we can't address this issue in isolation. Not one company can address this issue. The issue needs to occur in relationship, in partnership with government, civil society organizations, with different tech and SaaS platforms, working with different providers, working with peers, working with suppliers, working with investors. There's a level of complexity that's required in terms of collaboration in order to effectively address the complexity around the risk. Some of the key features which I've already described in terms of the criteria of the Modern Slavery Act, those terms are around describing risks. So that's criteria 3, 4, and 5. That's the kind of the crux of the reporting criteria. And all the other aspects of it are the padding of the legislation of like making sure that you actually identify clearly who you are as an organization and your structure, and that you've taken into account all the complexities of the organization. And that will be more relevant, I suppose, to a larger organization than a smaller one in terms of the different complexities there. But these are the kind of components, these are the kind of activities that the reporting criteria is asking. And this is what will be filtered down into if you like, the tier 1 or the direct supply chain. And you might be finding yourself as a non-reporting entity, as a supplier to one of these companies, one of your corporate clients, as they are trying to identify and address modern slavery risk. You might be reached out to, you might be asked to actually participate in this, because we know that the risks are in supply chains, and though the risk may not necessarily sit with you in terms of your organization, the risk will be beyond your organization. So who it is that you're actually buying from, not necessarily where the risks are in terms of being a distributor or a wholesaler. So the risks, a risk profile will need to be established. and you have a very key role in working with your clients to help them to have a very clear understanding of what those risks are, and working in partnership with them, hopefully, to help them to identify and address this issue. So there's a big role to play for Australia, for suppliers here in Australia. Just quickly then, in terms of the New South Wales Act, which has had its own journey, if you like, and was an amendment to the Act in 2021, and here the provisions of the Act were clarified and limited to take out the private sector, which was one of the components that was already in there, and it's already in the Federal Act. So when it comes to the Act, the New South Wales Act has an anti-slavery commissioner, Dr. James Cockayne, who is actually driving the implementation with a big focus, the main focus on state government procurement, state-run entities and corporations, and local government areas. So this is actually a huge undertaking and a huge area of procurement, because if we took out the defence budget from the federal government, New South Wales and state New South Wales procurement would actually be the largest procurer in the country for New South Wales. So if we took out the defence budget from the federal, then basically New South Wales have the largest spend. And so this is an enormous undertaking with some 300 or more entities that will need to actually do some work in this space. This again will have a very direct impact on SMEs who supply to local councils for events, or to state government entities, to departments, all the departments for the New South Wales government, corporations, and local government areas will need to be doing some work in this space, and that will very much have touch points with small business. The other side of the coin, with the Modern Slavery Act at the New South Wales level, it has to do with survivor support services, and some work has already been done to understand the gaps in that, and the report card so far is not great. In the sense that we don't have great structures in place to work with survivors and to make sure that people who are actually impacted in this country, and yes, we do have people impacted in this country, that they actually get the support that they need. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done to work at both at a federal and a state level with the authorities, with the police, with civil society groups, to actually make sure that people get the support that they need and ongoing support they need. So that's kind of the two main prongs of the New South Wales Act, and probably the one that pertains most especially to APPA members would have to do with state procurement and what you're selling to state government entities and local government. A great quote from Nolan and Bersma: "Modern slavery sits on a continuum of exploitation. It should not and cannot be addressed in isolation. In our bid to manage, reduce, and eliminate modern slavery, we need to first acknowledge the larger contextual problems from which it emerges, which should treat the symptoms and the causes." And so as we look across the landscape of addressing this issue, you might be sitting there here today thinking, oh my goodness, I'm a small team. I've got 5 people. I've got 10 people. I'm a sole trader. I really don't know to what extent I fully understand this issue, and I really don't know what I can do. And to be quite honest, in isolation, you probably can't do a lot apart from really setting up your own ethical sourcing policy and actually sourcing better, because you can't actually you probably are not in a position to have much leverage with suppliers that you're buying from who could actually be bigger than you. However, I think there's a lot of scope for APPA, and particularly as a peak body group and a collective membership, to actually work out ways in which you can actually work together and to create a bigger leverage to have the impact that you need. Most of the work around modern slavery due diligence will not necessarily be in Australia. It will be where the products are being made for the promotional products. And so we're looking at China, we're looking at Southeast Asia, and that raises a whole range of complications in terms of access, in terms of actually verification, boots on the ground, who actually knowing exactly where a product is being made and how it's being made. All that takes a tremendous amount of energy and time and investment. And so there's ways in which that needs to be done, but there's something to be considered as an industry, how we can actually do that effectively together. So in terms of the trends and the impact on small business, what we're seeing really is the emergence of criterion for major contracts linked to ESG finance. What this basically means is that in terms of the financial investment, in terms of where capital's coming for companies, there's a growing amount of funds being allocated to those organizations that are actually excelling in ESG, and that is a big acronym, a little acronym with a big meaning, but basically under this acronym, E stands for environmental, S is for social, G is for governance, and there are a number of impact areas. Modern slavery sits under S more specifically, but there are touch points with both G and E. There's a whole range of impact areas that companies need to consider, and the financial services sector is basically working where to actually invest and giving a priority really to those companies that are excelling in these areas. There is a big push back against China through the lack of transparency in supply chains. What's interesting is that as many parts of the world, including many Commonwealth countries, New Zealand, Canada, the UK, Australia, plus European countries, plus the United States, as the demand for transparency in these parts of the world increases, what we're seeing in response then is a crackdown in transparency in places like China. And so, for example, you may have seen reports recently about the manufacturing of solar panels in Xinjiang province. It's become almost impossible for any auditor or journalist to get into that province to actually verify the alleged risks of slavery among Uyghur populations. As the world looks for transparency, China is cracking down on that, and it's very difficult then to verify. So that is an added complexity, and it requires a diversification of supply chains. And then there are many factories that are actually shutting down due to a lack of environmental standards. So governments are cracking down, particularly in the environmental space, on companies that are actually big polluters who don't actually make improvements. So a lot of effort in ESG is going around on the E side of things, but there's more work that needs to be done in terms of the S, and particularly around the issue of modern slavery. One of the questions that any organization needs to think about when it comes to addressing the issue is really two issues on the axes that I have here. One has to do with capacity, the other has to do with appetite. And you might be sitting here today thinking, I have no capacity and I have no appetite, or I might have some appetite, but no capacity. And really what we're seeing in terms of trends, and the trends in relation to where the finance sector is putting money around ESG, that actually there's a great need for organizations to increase their capacity and to increase their appetite for change. And to do so brings, there's a business case for doing so. So if we think about the quadrant where there is appetite and there is capacity, then we have agility. So if the appetite is there and you're well-resourced to comply, then you'll have a license to operate in an ESG-oriented market. And this is really where this is a trajectory of competition, if you like, in the world. So it's not just a matter of having good quality products at the lowest price. Now there's a big push to ensure compliance with environmental, social, and governance standards. And this, in a sense, will increase agility. You might have the capacity, for example, but you have a low appetite, and therefore that will sort of render you a bit indifferent. If you have the appetite but lack the capacity, then you are at least responsive, and that's the next step, I suppose, to being agile. And that's where organizations such as Unchained can help you to build your capacity to get to a greater level of agility. And finally, the other quadrant, which we don't need to necessarily mention, is around ignorance. If you don't have any capacity and you have no appetite, then really you are, in a sense, putting yourself in the dark in terms of where the direction in which the market's moving, and the increased interest in ESG reporting, in human rights, in climate change, in the sourcing of solar energy, for example, or renewable energies, in making sure that there is attention to diversity, equity, inclusion, Indigenous procurement, et cetera, et cetera. So the list is huge, and there's a need for organizations to not put their head in the sand, but to actually work towards increasing capacity and increasing their appetite for change. In terms of really what we're seeing as top priorities for SMEs in the engagement with modern slavery and their clients, there are really three areas that you might need to consider, because these are the three areas that we're seeing in terms of our engagement. So on the governance side of things, for a long time, organizations simply needed to have some policy around modern slavery or a position statement demonstrating their commitment to addressing this issue, what they stand for, but also indicating now what kind of commitments they're making over the next 12 months or 2 years or 3 years to affect change. And so that's been a shift, not just having a position, I'm against modern slavery, but actually, and this is some of the activities that we're committing to. This is what we've done so far, and this is what we're committing to in the future. And part of that might actually be an increase in the policy portfolio. In the previous workshop I did 2 weeks ago, we talked about having an ethical policy portfolio and how to best frame that. And having one of those key items is around having a code of conduct or having an ethical sourcing policy to actually demonstrate that you are taking action on this issue. So that's governance, one. The second piece has to do with risk management, and this has to do with an investment in time and materials to actually identify risk. There's a great need and a great push to move those who are reporting under the Act to not just look at their suppliers in Australia, but actually to get greater clarity on what's going on overseas. So actually work and move through the supply chain, and you as a supplier to a corporate agent or corporate client have a role to play in assisting your clients with that. And we know that there's some risks with that. We know that many suppliers don't want to disclose who they're buying from because that might actually lower their competitiveness. But this is part of the transparency piece and the risk of actually having to disclose who you're actually buying from. The transparency can only bring about change in the supply chain. And there's a growing need. So we're seeing a greater emphasis on auditing. And I know that many of you are part of SEDEX or have suppliers who have been audited by SEDEX, for example, or ETI. There's a big push also around certifications and a growing awareness of the role of certifications in helping organizations to step up to the plate through a third party and meeting their criteria. And part of that also is that risk management is actually realizing, there's not much we can do perhaps, but to actually start sourcing ethically and looking for suppliers who have the right credentials, because we can't actually do much to verify credentials. And thirdly, it's around people and culture. So originally, organizations and clients were looking for at least a level of awareness, but now there's a great push towards skills training. So the internal capacity to not just know about the issue, such as what we're doing today, but actually have the skills and the know-how to actually address this issue effectively. So there's some of the trends, if you like, in terms of priorities for SMEs. You may already be engaged at some of this level, but you also might find yourself needing to do more. What we have seen is there has been a shift in the last 3 years in terms of what clients are actually asking organizations to do, and not just to sort of be in really alignment with their own programs and their own reporting mechanisms. And so you have a key role to play in the success of that, and you will also benefit from that. Part of the business case for addressing this issue really is around the 3 Ps. It's about having the right profile. And once we've started addressing some of these issues, then our profile is protected because we're putting in efforts to mitigate potential financial, legal, and that should be reputational, not reputational, but reputational risks. There'll be a sense of greater purpose, and depending on the size of your team, we know that, for example, for many Gen Ys and Gen Zs, those who are young in the workforce are really looking to work for organizations that have a very clear value proposition, that have a very clear purpose and something that they can actually contribute to and benefit from. And finally, it's really about profits. And for many organizations, the license to operate now is very much being hung on an environmental, social, and governance framework. It's not just about providing good quality products, although that is important. Part of the issue of quality, the notion of quality, I think, is being broadened to include due diligence on a range of impact areas as well. So it's not just the quality of the product, it's also the quality of the process and how things are being made, not just what is being made. So I just want to pause there to see if there's any, it's at the 1:45 mark, just to see if anyone has any questions before we go on to discuss what we have on offer for you today.
Looks like we have a few shy people. No questions have come through during the session. Just give people a chance, if they do, to submit something. Give it a minute or two. Very good presentation. A lot to think about.
Well, yes, there is, and it might leave a few people stunned. So I appreciate that. Yeah, people might walk away from today and just think, oh, well, I do have a question, I just don't know how to formulate that question. I'm like that. I rarely ask questions on a webinar, but I always think of the question later. So you might need to go away and have a little think about what you might want to what you need to do, and that's totally fine. And I welcome people reaching out to me to ask those questions. So let me then just go on to talk about what we have on offer through the partnership we have with APPA. We two things. One is more specifically for today. We have a range of e-learning modules that we can make available and sell both individually, and there's a discount for APPA members. And Tony, I think, has the links for these as well to send later. And we can also bundle them up as a package of 6 for people to use. And really that takes, will take your team from the high level of awareness, engaging with the issue of modern slavery, which very much is what I was speaking today, but take you through different topics around skills training. So a lot of these modules are about the capacity building, having a ethical sourcing and purchasing framework, identifying and managing risks, getting the policy portfolios together, how to measure impact, what does that actually mean, and then really what does it mean to actually go beyond and actually do due diligence. So that's probably the most advanced module. So each of the modules can be bought individually for $80 with a 10% discount, or as a package. We can also provide an enterprise agreement. If you have a bigger team and you want to buy more modules, we can actually put a special price together for you, and that can be invoiced if you don't want to purchase that through our portal. So all these modules can be bought using a credit card through a gateway that we use where we house and host the modules, and they can be bought individually or as a package in both those ways. If you do need, if you are a bigger team and you want to buy, say, 10 or 20 or 30 modules, particularly module 1 for your entire team, then we can talk about pricing and invoice you accordingly and give you access. The other offer, which is the previous offer from the last workshop that we did, has to do with our templates. So we have a range of templates. We have 6 templates, including a modern slavery position statement that you can use, purchase, and actually incorporate into your own policy portfolio. So if you don't have much by way of policies and you're being asked to show and demonstrate that you have a policy, then you can make yourself you can use ours. So for example, we sell them at $110 including GST per template, or we can package the 6 for $5, so you get 5 templates. So you 6 templates for the price of 5 as a package price. And I think, yeah, so Tony has all that information and can make that available to you. You can also be in touch with me if you want more information using the QR code, and reach out to me if you have any questions, if you want to discuss your business needs. I can also, offer APPA members a 15-minute consultation, really to discuss your needs free of charge, to discuss your specific situation.
Right, and just to add, look out for an email. We've got part 4 coming up on the 8th of June. The webinar that Stephen will also arrange. So in lieu of that, as there's no more questions, we'll close off the session. Thank you very much, Stephen. It's a fantastic presentation. And as Stephen said, over the coming days, you'll receive a follow-up email with a link to view today's recording, the PowerPoint presentation, and other relevant information. APPA members can reach out to Stephen via Stephen, that's with a PH, .morse, MORSE, at unchainsolutions.com.au, or via LinkedIn. I'll include this information as part of the post-webinar email. So on behalf of Stephen and APPA, thank you for all your participation in joining us today, and I hope you all have a great afternoon. So again, thank you very much, Stephen.
Thanks,
Hold
Tony.
on.
Thanks, everybody.
There was a
Great
question.
discussion.
There was something that
I think
came
it was
through.
it was a thank you.
Oh, it's a thank
Okay.
you. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
Appreciate
you, Michelle.
it. All right, well, we'll close that off. And again, look out for the last of the webinars on the 8th of June. We'll send out some information for you to register on that. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.